The beginning of the nightmare. The room was cold, dark, silent, except for the soft hum of machinery. It smelled of metal and chemicals, the air thick and heavy. There was no window, no way to know where she was, what planet this was, or if anyone was even looking for her. Her name was Emily, and she had been captured by the Zorksians, a ruthless alien race known for their cruelty. They were strong, fast, and had no mercy. Emily had been on a peaceful mission to explore distant planets, one of many human expeditions to make contact with alien species. She had hoped to learn, to make peace. But the Zorksians were not interested in peace. They saw the humans as weak, as nothing more than prey. She had learned this the hard way. The day started as any other. She and her team had landed on the Zorksian planet, hoping to introduce themselves and offer resources in exchange for knowledge. At first, things seemed to go well. But the moment they stepped into the Zorksian city, everything changed. The locals attacked without warning, capturing her and her crew before they had a chance to defend themselves. Emily had tried to fight back. She always did. She wasn't a soldier, but she had training. The Zorksians, though, were too powerful. They overpowered her easily, knocking her unconscious before she could make a move. When she woke up, she was alone in the cold room, tied to a metal chair. Her wrists and ankles were bound tightly with thick, glowing cables, the kind that pulsed with energy. The chair she was in was uncomfortable, metallic, and had no cushions. It felt as though it was designed to hold her in place while they broke her. She was scared. No, terrified. But there was something else, too, a deep feeling of uncertainty. She didn't know if she would survive this. She didn't know if anyone was coming for her. Her heart raced as she heard footsteps approaching from behind. They were heavy, deliberate. The door to the small room slid open, and she could hear the hiss of air as the Zorksian guards entered. There were two of them, massive, towering creatures with dark gray scales, long clawed hands, and cold, reptilian eyes. Their faces were strange, part insect, part lizard, with rows of sharp teeth lining their mouths. "She is awake," one of the Zorksians said, his voice deep and guttural. Emily couldn't speak. She didn't know how to respond. Her throat felt dry, and she was overwhelmed by fear. She tried to focus, to calm her breathing, but it was impossible. They were going to kill her. She knew it. She had heard the stories. The Zorksians didn't leave prisoners alive. They tortured their captives for information, for sport, and when they were done, they disposed of the body like it was nothing. The larger of the two aliens approached her. He towered over her, his eyes studying her like a hunter eyeing his prey. Emily tried to shrink back in the chair, but the cables held her in place. She couldn't move. The alien leaned in close, his breath hot and foul against her face. "You are human," he said slowly, as though tasting the word. "You will tell us everything, every secret you have, every weakness of your people." Emily's stomach twisted. She had no idea what they wanted. She wasn't military. She didn't know any valuable secrets. All she had was her knowledge of the planets she had visited and the peaceful mission she had tried to carry out. She had nothing to offer, and yet she knew the Zorksians wouldn't care. "Speak," the alien commanded, his voice sharp like a knife. He stepped back, raising a strange device in his hand. It was a long metallic rod with glowing lines running through it. Emily had seen this device before, in her training. It was a torture device, designed to break the mind. She shuddered at the thought of what it could do. But she refused to speak. She couldn't give them anything. She didn't even know what they wanted. "Very well," the Zorksian said, his tone suddenly cold. He raised the rod and activated it. The moment it touched her skin, pain shot through her entire body. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before. Every nerve screamed. Her muscles spasmed uncontrollably. The pain didn't stop. It just kept going, tearing through her mind, her body, until she could no longer distinguish where the pain ended and where her own thoughts began. Her head felt heavy, and her vision blurred. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but no sound came from her throat. The Zorksians were merciless. They didn't care about her pain. "Tell us," the alien demanded again, his voice echoing in her mind. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, sharp and shallow. She was gasping for air, but the pain wouldn't stop. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat slower than the last. She had to stay strong. She couldn't give in. The room felt like it was spinning. She couldn't focus anymore. Her head felt like it was filled with fog. And then, everything went quiet. For just a moment, she felt nothing. It was as if the world had stopped, as if she were floating in a void. And then, her heart stopped. The pain was gone. The breathing, the gasping, everything ceased. Her mind went blank. There was no sound, no thought, no fear, only silence. The Zorksians did not notice at first. They were too busy with their interrogation. But something had changed. Emily was no longer breathing. Her heart was no longer beating. Her life was slipping away. But as Emily hung on the edge of consciousness, she didn't give up hope. Not yet. She knew someone would come. Someone had to. Someone had to save her. The brutal interrogation begins. The darkness of the room was overwhelming. The air was thick and suffocating. Every breath felt like it took more effort than the last. Emily's head swam with dizziness, and her chest felt heavy, as though a great weight had been placed on it. The harsh, flickering lights above her seemed to pulse with a cruel rhythm, as if mocking her helplessness. She tried to focus, to steady her thoughts, but the pain was still there, lingering like a shadow in her mind. For a long moment, nothing moved. The two Zorksian guards stood quietly, their cold, reptilian eyes watching her, waiting for her to recover. Emily could hear the faint sound of their breath, their deep, guttural inhalations that echoed in the room. She couldn't tell if they were looking at her as a person or as something to be broken, as something to be crushed under their heels. They were waiting for her to speak. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. There was nothing to say. Her body felt numb, and her mind was clouded with confusion. The pain from the torturous device still throbbed through her veins, a constant, pulsing reminder of what they were capable of. She had no idea how long she had been in this room, but time seemed to stretch on endlessly. It could have been hours, or it could have been minutes. All she knew was that she was trapped, helpless, and alone. And that terrified her. The larger of the two Zorksians stepped forward, his heavy footsteps reverberating through the room. His long claws scraped across the floor, each movement slow and deliberate, as if he was savoring the moment. Emily's heart raced again, her breath quickening in fear. She was only human, weak, fragile, and these creatures were the epitome of power. They were stronger, faster, and more ruthless than anything she had ever encountered. She had no chance against them, but still, she held on to that small sliver of hope, the belief that maybe, just maybe, someone was looking for her. Someone would come. The Zorksian leaned in closer, his massive frame towering over her. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face. Emily could feel his gaze like a cold weight on her skin. And for a moment, she wished she could just disappear, to escape his piercing stare. But she couldn't. She was trapped. Her body was bound, and her strength was failing her. She was nothing more than prey to these monsters. "You will tell us everything," the Zorksian growled, his voice low and menacing. His breath stank of sulfur and something worse, a thick, rotten odor that made her stomach churn. Emily fought the urge to gag, trying her best to hold her composure. But she refused. She would not give them the satisfaction of breaking her. They might have captured her, but they couldn't take her will. Not yet. She wouldn't betray her people. She wouldn't give them the information they sought. They could kill her, they could torture her, but they would never get what they wanted. The Zorksian hissed in irritation, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. Without warning, he grabbed her face roughly with one of his clawed hands, his fingers digging into her skin. Emily gasped in pain, her vision blurring from the force of the grip. She could feel the raw power of his hand, as if he could crush her skull with a single squeeze. But she refused to scream. She wouldn't give him that. "Stubborn," the Zorksian muttered. He released her face and stepped back, pacing for a moment, his eyes never leaving her. Emily felt a wave of nausea sweep over her. The alien's presence was oppressive, like a shadow that loomed over her, suffocating her in its weight. After what felt like an eternity, the Zorksian turned and motioned to the other guard. The second Zorksian, smaller but still imposing, moved toward a large metallic device in the corner of the room. It looked like nothing Emily had ever seen before. Its surface was smooth and sleek, covered in glowing blue lines that pulsed softly in the darkness. The alien fiddled with it for a moment, before pressing a button. There was a low hum, followed by a sudden crackling sound, as though the device was coming to life. Emily's heart sank as the guard turned toward her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. She didn't know what the device was, but she knew it couldn't be good. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The same feeling she had before the torture began. The cold, sinking dread that made every muscle in her body tense with fear. The second Zorksian approached, holding the device out toward her. It was a long rod, silver and sleek, with small metal tendrils at the end that glowed brightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. One of their interrogation tools. The Zorksians were known for using these devices to break their captives, to extract information from them in the cruelest ways possible. Without warning, the Zorksian activated the device. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the room, and Emily felt a sudden, intense pressure against her temples. It wasn't physical pain at first, but something far worse, mental, as though her thoughts were being pried open, torn apart. She gasped, trying to block out the sensation, but it was impossible. It was as though the device was digging into her mind, pulling out her memories, her thoughts, her fears. Every moment of her life was being exposed to these creatures. Her heart raced, her head throbbed, and she screamed in agony. "Tell us what we need to know," the Zorksian barked, his voice cutting through the sharp, invasive hum of the device. Emily's body spasmed as the device pulsed again, sending waves of excruciating pain through her skull. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus. The pressure was unbearable. But through the haze of agony, one thought remained clear: she would not give in. But the Zorksians didn't care. They didn't need to break her body. They only needed to break her will. And that, Emily realized with a sinking heart, was going to be the hardest fight of her life, the unexpected miracle. As the torture continued, time seemed to lose all meaning. Each moment bowled into the next, an unrelenting cycle of pain and fear that twisted around Emily's mind like a suffocating fog. Her thoughts were a haze, the sharp edges of her memory dulling with every passing second. She could feel her strength slipping away, her body failing her. Yet there was one thing she refused to lose: her will. Her heart, though slowing, still beat with a spark of defiance. But the Zorksians were relentless, their methods insidious. The mental device they had attached to her mind hummed incessantly, dragging her deeper into the abyss of her own thoughts. Each pulse felt like 1,000 needles driving into her skull, each wave of pain sending shockwaves through her entire body. It was like drowning, her mind and body locked in a battle she couldn't win. She had to hold on. She couldn't let them break her, not when there was so much at stake. She was on the edge, her consciousness slipping away, when the door to the room suddenly slid open again. The unmistakable hiss of the doorway and the sound of footsteps filled the air. But this time, they were different. There was something more, something out of place in the usual rhythm of the Zorksians' movements. The two guards, distracted by the new arrival, turned sharply toward the door. Emily barely noticed them, her vision swimming, but she could make out the figures of two more Zorksians. One of them was tall and imposing, like the others, but the other was different. This one was smaller, his movements more fluid, and his eyes didn't have the same coldness as the others. There was a flicker of something else there, something strange, almost human. Emily barely had the strength to raise her head, but she did anyway, desperate for any kind of distraction from the agony of the device. The guard stepped aside, allowing the newcomer to approach her. She couldn't see his face clearly from where she sat, but there was a feeling she couldn't ignore, a strange sense of hope that flickered deep inside her, like a light in the darkness. "Stop it," the voice of the newcomer commanded, low and firm. There was an authority in the words, but it was different from the harsh tones of the other Zorksians. This was not a command given by one of their kind. This was something else. The guards froze, confused by the stranger's presence. The tall Zorksian growled in warning. "This is not your business, Euler. Return to your post." But Euler, Emily could feel the name, didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked onto the device in her head, the device that was continuing to tear apart her mind. "You're making a mistake," Euler said, his voice calmer now, softer but filled with something that made the other guards uneasy. "She's already lost. You're only torturing her further." Emily's body shuddered involuntarily, the pressure from the device still relentless. She tried to focus on the conversation, trying to make sense of the words, but it was difficult. Her mind was still swimming in pain. "Do not lecture us, Euler," one of the guards barked. "This human will break. They all do." Euler didn't respond to the challenge. Instead, he moved forward, his hands outstretched. "She's already broken, but you don't have to make her suffering last longer." Something in the air shifted, a quiet tension hanging between them. The guard's eyes narrowed, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel a shift in the atmosphere, like a turning tide, a change she hadn't expected. This alien, Euler, seemed different. Unlike the others, he wasn't filled with malice. Instead, there was something almost familiar in his voice. The next few moments unfolded in slow motion. Without warning, Euler reached for the device. His fingers moved quickly, expertly, and the guard's protestations were too late. The device suddenly powered down with a sharp whine, and the searing pain in Emily's mind vanished. For a brief, breathless second, she didn't know whether to cry in relief or fall into despair. She had never thought she would know peace again. But now, the pain was gone. Her heart, still weak, began to slow, the pressure in her chest easing. The guards were still stunned, their mouths slightly open as Euler stepped away from Emily, the device deactivated in his hand. "You," one of the Zorksians snarled, "you have betrayed us." Euler didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was an unmistakable resolve in them. Something that had been missing in the other Zorksians. "I haven't betrayed you. I've saved her." The tall Zorksian raised his weapon in anger. "You'll regret this. We will make sure you." But Euler cut him off with a swift gesture, a hand held out to stop him. "It's over. You can do nothing to stop what's coming." Emily felt the tension building. Her head still swam, her body weak, but something in Euler's words sparked a small flame of hope in her chest. "What's coming?" she thought, but she didn't have the strength to ask. She could barely stay conscious. The guards seemed to hesitate. They didn't know what to do. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the deactivated device. Euler's eyes flicked between the two of them, and without another word, he turned to her. His voice softened as he spoke again, this time almost gentle. "You're not alone," he said. "I won't let them hurt you anymore." Emily's eyelids fluttered as the exhaustion hit her all at once. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a glimmer of peace. She didn't understand what was happening, or who this alien was, but she could feel it. He was her chance, her only chance. Before she could say anything, darkness claimed her, and she fell into unconsciousness, unaware of the danger still lurking behind the walls of the alien ship. The heart-stopping moment. The silence that followed Euler's intervention was thick and oppressive. Emily's mind, fragile and flickering like a candle in a storm, struggled to make sense of what had just happened. She barely registered the Zorxian guards as they hesitated, their confused glances exchanged in the dim light. They had not expected this, the betrayal from one of their own. But despite the growing tension, Emily was not aware of their movements. Her body, weakened by torture and exhaustion, had finally given in to the darkness. Her chest rose and fell with slow, shallow breaths as her consciousness began to slip away completely. The agony of the interrogation had drained her, leaving nothing but a hollow emptiness in its wake. The lights in the room seemed to blur, the edges of her vision softening, until all that was left was the deep pull of unconsciousness. But then something stirred deep within her chest. A sudden pressure, a pulse, a thudding beat. Her heart, or rather, what was left of it. She felt it first as a tightening sensation, a sharp twinge in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced before. But then it grew. The sensation deepened, spreading from the center of her body like a shockwave. It was as if something was wrong. So wrong. The flutter of life inside her began to stutter, like a fragile pulse struggling against overwhelming forces. Her heart, weakened by the years of relentless training and the crushing pain of the torture device, was failing. Her breath caught in her throat. She gasped, but no air seemed to fill her lungs. Panic flooded her body, but the darkness continued to draw closer, blurring the world around her. Emily fought to hold on, to find the strength she didn't have. She wanted to call out. She wanted to scream. But her mouth was dry, and her body refused to move. The pressure in her chest increased, as if an invisible hand was slowly tightening around her heart, squeezing out the life force within her. And then it stopped. For one endless second, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no pain. Just a cold, cruel silence that hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. Emily couldn't feel the steady rhythm of her pulse. Her chest felt hollow, empty. Her heart, once so steady and strong, had stopped beating. The guards watched, unsure of what to make of it. The large Zorxian, still standing near the door, made no move to intervene. The other Zorxian, who had been watching Ular, seemed to take a step forward, as if sensing the change. Ular, however, was far more perceptive. He was already by her side, crouching down with a calmness that belied the urgency of the situation. His eyes, once cold, now softened, a glimmer of something almost human flickering within them. For the first time, Emily noticed the gentleness in his gaze, and it gave her the faintest spark of hope. But it was fleeting. Her chest no longer moved. Her breathing had stopped altogether. The pulse that had once been there was gone. Her body was still, lifeless. The light in her eyes had dulled, her skin pale, her lips tinged with blue. Ular's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for her with trembling hands. The Zorxians, for all their alien physiology and cruelty, were momentarily frozen by the sight. This wasn't supposed to happen. Humans were supposed to break. They were supposed to surrender. This wasn't part of the plan. Ular didn't hesitate. Without looking back, without a single word to the others, he placed his hands gently over Emily's chest. The air seemed to crackle around him as his fingers pressed down, his mind racing. He had no time to waste. The alien guards, still standing awkwardly near the door, exchanged glances, unsure of how to react to this sudden turn of events. They had not anticipated Ular taking such actions, nor had they been prepared for the possibility that this human could be saved. But Ular wasn't concerned with their confusion. His focus was entirely on Emily, his mind locked on the task at hand. He took a deep breath and spoke softly to her, as if trying to comfort her in her final moments. "Don't give up. Stay with me." His hands pressed harder against her chest. His fingers, once delicate, now moved with purpose. He wasn't sure what exactly he was doing. He wasn't trained in human physiology, but he had an instinct. He had always trusted that instinct. And right now, it told him that he had to try. He had to save her. With a quick movement, Ular twisted his wrist, activating a hidden device in his sleeve. It was small, merely invisible, but it pulsed with an eerie blue light. The device hummed to life, sending a current of energy through his fingers and into her chest. A low, rhythmic pulse filled the room, the same kind of frequency that resonated through the alien's heart. It wasn't meant for humans, but it could work, if only it could trigger the spark of life once more. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, and Emily's body remained motionless, still as stone. Eular's hands shook with the intensity of the moment. His breath came quicker, but he didn't give up. Then, just as despair threatened to pull them under, a faint sound broke the silence. It was soft at first, a whisper of a sound, like the flutter of wings. A faint heartbeat, then another, and another. It was slow, weak, but it was there. Emily's heart began to beat again. Slowly, laboriously, but unmistakably. Euler let out a breath of relief, his heart pounding in his chest as he pressed his hands over hers, his touch firm but gentle. Her eyes fluttered open, a faint glimmer of awareness returning to her. Her vision was blurry, her breath shallow, but she was alive. The pain, the darkness, had faded to the edges of her mind. She felt the warmth of Euler's hands over hers, the steady rhythm of her heart slowly returning. But her body wasn't free of the consequences. She could feel the fragility in her chest. The heartbeat was weak, vulnerable, but it was there. She was still alive. She had been given a second chance, and that, she realized, was all she needed. A glimmer of hope. Emily's senses returned slowly, like a fog lifting from her mind. The world around her was a blur, the shadows of the alien room mingling with the soft light of something unfamiliar. Her chest still felt tight, as if her body had been pulled too far, stretched beyond its limits, and now she was trying to catch up. The slow, rhythmic thud of her heart echoed in her ears, a sound she hadn't thought she would ever hear again. She opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh lights overhead, and the world came into focus. Her body was still weak, but she was alive. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her skin cold to the touch, but there was life in her now. Euler was crouched beside her, his face inches from hers, his eyes soft and steady. He had done it. He had brought her back. For a brief moment, Emily couldn't process what had happened. The weight of the interrogation, the pain of the Zorxian torture, the sudden stop of her heart, all of it seemed like a distant memory. It was like she was caught between two worlds, one where she was broken and lifeless, and another where she was somehow revived, suspended between life and death. "You're awake," Euler said quietly, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos that swirled around them. His eyes were full of concern, yet there was something else there, something like relief. "I thought I had lost you." Emily tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and words refused to come. She could only nod, a small, weak gesture. Her mind was clouded, her body still too frail to process the overwhelming rush of emotions that surged through her. She wanted to ask him how he had done it, why he had helped her, but all she could manage was a single quiet breath. She didn't even know if she had the strength to speak at all. Euler, sensing her confusion, leaned closer, his hands hovering just above her chest, careful not to cause any more strain. "You're safe now. I won't let them hurt you again." The words washed over her, and for the first time since her capture, Emily felt the smallest spark of hope ignite within her. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to erase the fear, the pain, or the overwhelming uncertainty of their situation, but it was a beginning. She wasn't alone anymore. Her head throbbed as she tried to sit up, her body protesting with every movement. But Euler gently placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her to lie still. "Rest. You need to recover. It's not safe here." "Not yet." Emily's mind raced, but her body refused to cooperate. The words he spoke were both comforting and terrifying. The Zorxians hadn't just tortured her, they had captured her, and who knew what else they would do to her if they realized she was still alive. A cold shiver ran through her as the memory of the guards' sneering faces and cruel words flooded back. The interrogations, the endless pain, they hadn't stopped. If Euler hadn't intervened, she didn't want to finish that thought. But even as the fear lingered, something else rose within her: determination. Euler had saved her life, and now she had to repay that in some way. She had to fight. She had to survive. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, the soft scraping of metal against metal, a hiss from the door opening. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening with the sudden return of fear. The Zorxian guards. They were coming back. Euler stood, his posture shifting instantly from the calm, protective figure to something more dangerous. The softness in his eyes hardened, his body tensing as he moved to stand between Emily and the door. She barely had the strength to lift her head, but she did, her vision still blurry as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The door slid open, and two Zorxian guards stepped in, their eyes flicking from Euler to Emily with suspicion. One of them, taller, more imposing, snarled as he saw Emily's still form, her breathing slow but steady. His eyes narrowed in confusion. She's still alive. Euler didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, blocking their path, his gaze hard and unwavering. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. She lives because I allowed it. You will not harm her again. The guards hissed, taken aback by the sheer force of Euler's words. The room was tense, thick with unspoken threats, as if the very air around them had been charged with electricity. Emily's heart beat faster, her breath shallow as she watched the standoff unfold before her. Euler's stance was unyielding, his body language a clear message. He would not back down. Not this time. The guards seemed to hesitate, their eyes flicking between each other, before the larger one grunted in frustration and stepped back. She's a liability, the guard spat, his tone venomous. If the higher command finds out. They won't find out, Euler interrupted sharply. His voice was filled with an eerie calm that didn't match the threat in his words. And if you want to survive this, you'll stay out of my way. The other guard's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. They both stood in silence for a long moment, the tension palpable. Then, with a snarl of frustration, the larger one turned and motioned to his companion. Let's go. But this isn't over, Euler, he growled, before exiting the room. Euler didn't move, watching them leave, his eyes hard and calculating. Only once the door slid shut behind them did he allow himself a breath of relief. He turned back to Emily, his gaze softening as he knelt beside her once more. They'll be back, he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. But we have time. Time to plan. Time to escape. Emily met his gaze, and for the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of certainty. She wasn't powerless anymore. She wasn't alone. And with Euler's help, she could escape. There was hope now, just a tiny spark, but it was enough to ignite something fierce inside her. The fire of survival, of defiance. And she wasn't going to let it go out. The alien betrayal. The silence in the room lingered, thick with the promise of something yet to come. Emily's heart, though still weak, beat steadily in her chest. She was alive, and with every passing moment, the fog in her mind began to lift. Her body was battered, fragile, but it still carried the will to fight. The question was, how? How could she survive this alien ship, surrounded by enemies, trapped in the heart of their fortress? Euler seemed to understand her unspoken thoughts, though. He paced the small room, his gaze sharp, his every movement calculated. His alien form was different from the rest, less monstrous, more measured. Emily had seen the cold, merciless brutality of the other Zorxians, but Euler was different. He wasn't like them. He wasn't part of their cruel system. And that fact was beginning to gnaw at Emily's mind, offering a glimmer of understanding. Why had he helped her? Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, as she looked up at him. Why are you doing this? Why save me? Euler paused, his back to her, before turning slowly. The words he spoke next were careful, each one heavy with meaning. I'm not what they think I am. I never have been. I've seen too much of their cruelty, their thirst for power. It sickens me. His eyes, usually cold and distant, softened for a moment as he met her gaze. I didn't expect to save you. Not like this. But when I saw what they were doing to you, I couldn't just stand by. Emily was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had never considered that someone among the Zorksians could feel like she did, that they could question their own people, their own actions. But Euler wasn't just questioning. He was choosing a side, and that choice made him dangerous to the others. Dangerous enough that they might turn on him. Before she could ask more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall outside their cell, loud and purposeful. Euler stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Emily tensed, knowing that danger was closing in on them. The guards, those monstrous creatures, were on their way back. But this time, something was different. The footsteps didn't belong to the usual Zorksian guards. There was a familiar click in their stride, a rhythm that spoke of command. Emily's pulse quickened. It wasn't the usual patrol. It was something more. Someone high up in the hierarchy of the Zorksians was approaching. Euler moved quickly, his face a mask of calm determination. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice low. "It's not just the guards. There's a higher command on the way. I didn't think they'd come so soon." Emily nodded, though she felt the familiar fear creeping back. She had no weapons, no tools, nothing but her resolve. And Euler, he was the only one who could keep her safe, the only one who seemed to be willing to fight back. She trusted him. But how far would that trust go? Could she trust him enough to fight with him, to escape with him? Was there even an escape? The door slid open again, and the two Zorksian guards from earlier stepped in, their expressions grim. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them, a tall figure in dark armor, draped in the insignia of Zorksian command, entered the room. The figure's presence was overwhelming, his very being radiating authority. He was their leader, the one the guards had feared. His face was hidden behind a sleek, black mask, but his eyes glowed with a terrifying intensity. This was no ordinary officer. This was someone high-ranking, someone who commanded respect, and perhaps even fear. The room grew tense in an instant. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. The man, or whatever he was the one who had the power to make their lives even worse. Euler, however, stood his ground, not an ounce of fear in his stance. He faced the commander with a cool, unwavering gaze. "Euler." The commander's voice rang out, deep and powerful, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. "I've been waiting for this moment." Emily could feel the weight of the words, the implications. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. This wasn't just about torture. This was about something far darker. The Zorksian commander's eyes flicked to her, then back to Euler. "You betrayed us," the commander said, his tone almost mocking. "You chose to protect this human, and now you're a traitor to your own kind. You'll be punished for this." Euler's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I didn't betray anyone. I simply stopped doing what I was told. You, on the other hand, have done nothing but sow destruction across the galaxy, and it needs to end." A cold smile twisted across the commander's face. "You think you can stop us? You think you can stop me?" His voice rose, growing louder, more dangerous with every word. "You, who have spent your life in service to us. You'll pay for your weakness. You'll watch as everything you've tried to protect falls apart." Euler didn't flinch. "It's already falling apart. Your empire is built on fear, on control. But that's not going to last. Not anymore." The commander's eyes narrowed, and Emily could feel the room pulse with tension. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel it. A shift. A betrayal from within their own ranks. Euler wasn't just trying to save her. He was trying to change everything. And he wasn't going to stop. "Bring her," the commander barked suddenly, pointing at Emily. "We will make an example of her. And then we will deal with you, Ular." But before the guards could move, Ular acted. His hand shot out, a blur of motion, and with one swift, decisive strike, he disabled the control panel that held the door shut, sending it sliding open with a loud crash. "Run," Ular whispered urgently to Emily, his voice fierce. "Now." Without thinking, she leaped to her feet, her body protesting the movement, but she didn't hesitate. The time for fear was over. If she wanted to survive, she had to act now. But as she bolted toward the exit, she felt a sharp pain rip through her side. She gasped, stumbling forward, but Ular was there, catching her, steadying her. "Keep moving," he said. "You're not alone." And then, the door slammed shut behind them, and they were free, at least for now. But Emily knew that the real battle was just beginning. She wasn't just fighting to escape anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. For freedom. For a future. For survival. And she had no idea where that fight would take her. The final escape and victory. The cold corridors of the Zorxian ship seemed to stretch on forever. The walls pulsed with a sickly green glow, flickering in the low light, casting long shadows that seemed to chase them down the narrow hallways. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled forward, her legs weak beneath her. Every step felt like an eternity, and the burning ache in her side, a reminder of the blow she'd taken, made her movements more sluggish. But Ular was there, close by her side, always one step ahead, his eyes darting around with quick, calculating precision. They had made it past the guards, past the commander, but the danger was far from over. The ship was a labyrinth of hallways, control rooms, and security checkpoints. The moment they were discovered, their chance of escaping would be shattered. Emily could feel it in the air, the tension, the weight of the impending pursuit. Time was their enemy now, and every second counted. How much farther? Emily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She felt her body growing weaker with each step, but there was no time to stop. Ular glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but his movements were sure, decisive. His face was a mix of determination and urgency. "We're almost there," Ular replied, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay close. If we can reach the engine room, we'll have a chance." Emily's mind was spinning. The engine room. She didn't know what they would find there. But Ular's confidence gave her a flicker of hope. They had come so far. She couldn't allow herself to fail now. She couldn't let Ular down, not after everything he had done to keep her alive. They rounded a corner, and Ular stopped suddenly, raising a hand to signal her to be quiet. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Ahead, there was a group of Zorxian soldiers, gathered in the hallway, their weapons drawn. Their cold, predatory eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. They had been discovered. Ular didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he pulled Emily into the shadow of a nearby alcove, his hand on her arm, steadying her as she fought to remain silent. She could hear the soldiers speaking in their guttural tongue, their words harsh and sharp. Her heart raced, and her breath seemed impossibly loud in her chest. She thought they had been caught for sure. Then Ular moved. Fast. His body was a blur of motion, almost too quick for Emily to follow. In one fluid motion, he silently disabled the first soldier with a precise strike to the neck, rendering him unconscious before he could make a sound. Emily's eyes widened in surprise, but there was no time to react. Ular grabbed her hand, pulling her into motion again, his grip firm and urgent. They slipped past the remaining soldiers, moving with the swiftness of shadows. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, the echo of their footsteps on the metallic floor the only noise as they continued to push forward. Ular moved like a ghost, blending into the darkness, leading them ever closer to the engine room. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Emily's exhaustion was becoming unbearable, but she held on. She focused on her breathing, steadying her pace, refusing to let her body betray her now. There was too much at stake, too many people who depended on them. And then, finally, they'd reached it, the engine room. The door to the room was massive, a thick slab of reinforced steel. Euler approached it with purpose, his movements sharp. He tapped in a code on a nearby terminal, his hands moving with practiced ease, and the door slid open with a low hiss. Inside, the room was filled with the sound of rumbling engines, the deep hum of power that ran through the very veins of the Zorxian ship. Euler motioned for Emily to follow him inside, his eyes scanning the room. "This is our chance," he whispered, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. "We can disable the ship's engines from here. Once it's down, they won't be able to pursue us." Emily's eyes widened as she looked around. The room was filled with alien technology, strange machines that hummed and pulsed with an energy she didn't understand. She didn't have the knowledge to operate any of it, but Euler did. He moved with certainty, heading straight for a control panel built into the far wall. He worked quickly, his fingers dancing across the buttons and switches, his mind clearly racing. Emily watched him, her breath shallow, her mind still fogged with exhaustion. She had to trust him. He knew what he was doing. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallway outside, and Euler's movements grew more frantic. Emily could feel the time slipping away. "Almost there," Euler muttered, his face tight with concentration. "Once I hit this, the entire ship will lose power. It'll buy us the time we need to escape." Just as he pressed the final sequence, the door to the engine room exploded open. A group of Zorxian soldiers, led by the commander, burst into the room, weapons drawn and aimed directly at them. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. They were too late. They had been caught. The commander's voice rang out, filled with fury. "You think you can escape, Euler? You betrayed us, and now you will pay for it." Euler didn't flinch. His eyes never left the control panel. "I've already won," he said, his voice calm. But there was a fierce, undeniable conviction in it. "The ship is already compromised. You won't catch us." Before the commander could respond, Euler slammed his fist onto the final button, and the entire room shook with the force of the ship's engines shutting down. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the hum of the ship's power died, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The commander's face twisted with rage, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You fool," he shouted, but Euler was already moving. He grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward the back of the room, where a small escape pod was docked. The door slid open, and Euler shoved Emily inside, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the alarms. Before the commander could react, Euler followed her inside, slamming the pod's door shut behind them. The pod's engines roared to life, and with a sudden burst of power, it shot out of the ship, leaving the crumbling Zorxian vessel behind. As they sped away from the wreckage, Emily allowed herself a moment of relief. The danger wasn't over, but they were alive. They had made it, and no matter what happened next, they had won. Together, they had escaped the darkness, the cruelty, the oppression. They had defied the odds. And in that moment, Emily realized something powerful. Hope wasn't just a dream. It was something they had fought for. And now, they had it.